In quiet Mapleton, Connecticut, a 75-year-old retired librarian was about to overturn decades of assumptions. What began as a casual family gathering erupted into chaos when they mocked her college aspirations as senile delusions. Eleanor Whittaker wasn't your average senior citizen. For 42 years, she had cataloged knowledge and inspired young minds, known for her encyclopedic memory and unwavering determination. When her grandchildren snickered at her plans to earn a degree, they had no inkling they were awakening a formidable opponent. Eleanor's revelation of her perfect SAT scores and acceptance letter to Westridge University would lead to consequences they never anticipated. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The crystal water glasses stood untouched on Eleanor Whittaker's polished oak dining table, condensation forming rings on the coasters she'd meticulously placed. The roast chicken had cooled, the once fluffy mashed potatoes now stiff and unappealing. But no one seemed to notice or care. The silence stretched across the table like a physical presence, broken only by the soft ticking of the antique grandfather clock in the corner, Roger's pride and joy, the one possession she couldn't bear to part with since his passing 4 years ago. Eleanor smoothed the linen napkin across her lap and tried again. As I was saying, the application process was actually quite straightforward. Westridge has a wonderful program for non-traditional students, Mom. David's voice carried that particular tone she remembered from his adolescence, the one that signaled he was explaining something painfully obvious to someone incapable of understanding. You're 75 years old. I'm well aware of my age, thank you, Eleanor replied, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. Samantha set down her wine glass with a deliberate clink. The gesture reminded Eleanor of how her daughter-in-law handled board meetings at the consulting firm where she'd recently made partner. What David is trying to say is that college at your stage of life is, well, it's just not practical. My stage of life? Eleanor's fingers tightened around her water glass. And what stage would that be exactly? The retirement stage, David said, leaning forward with the expression of someone explaining a simple concept to a child. The stage where you're supposed to be enjoying your golden years with bridge club and gardening. Not sitting in classrooms with teenagers, pretending to be, he gestured vaguely with his hand, a college student. The word, pretending, struck Eleanor like a physical blow. For 42 years, she had managed the Mapleton Public Library, transformed it from a dusty book repository into a vibrant community center, secured grants when the town budget threatened cuts, and introduced technological innovations despite resistance from the board. She had raised a son, supported her husband through his long illness, and maintained their Victorian home through economic downturns and personal crises. But her son thought her educational aspirations were pretense. It's a degree in literary analysis and criticism, she said quietly. I've been reading these books and discussing these ideas informally for decades. I simply want the credentials too. You've been reading books. Samantha's laugh was sharp, professional, the same laugh she probably used when clients suggested unreasonable project timelines. Mom, reading Jane Austen for your book club isn't the same as academic literary analysis. College courses require rigorous analytical writing, research methodologies, critical theory. Heat rose in Eleanor's cheeks. She stood, her chair scraping against the hardwood floor, and walked to the mahogany secretary desk that had belonged to her grandmother. From behind a row of leather-bound classics, she withdrew a manila folder thick with papers, printouts, and official documents. She set it on the table with a soft thud. SAT results, she said, opening the folder. Taken last month. Perfect score on the verbal section. She pulled out another document. Acceptance letter from Westridge University with a half tuition. Scholarship for academic merit. And this, she unfolded a course catalog, is the program I'll be starting next semester. I've already registered for classes. David's face went pale. Samantha's mouth opened slightly, then closed. I've been preparing for this since before your father died, Eleanor continued, her voice steady despite the racing of her heart. He knew about the practice tests, the online courses I took to refresh my mathematics skills. He encouraged me. Said it was never too late to pursue the education I set aside when we married. Mom, David's voice had lost its condescending edge, replaced by something that sounded almost panicked. That's your retirement fund. Your security. You can't just throw it away on some what, David? Some dream that doesn't fit your idea of what a 75-year-old woman should want? Samantha recovered first, sliding back into her corporate problem-solver mode. It's not about age, Mom. It's about practicality. A college degree at this point in your life won't advance your career or increase your earning potential. The return on investment simply isn't there. Not everything is measured by financial return, Samantha, Eleanor replied. Some investments pay dividends in personal satisfaction, intellectual growth, and self-respect. But what about your health? David interjected. College is stressful, late nights, heavy reading loads, exams. At your age, my health is excellent, Eleanor interrupted. Dr. Feldman gave me a clean bill of health last month. My blood pressure is better than yours, David, and my cholesterol numbers would make your cardiologist very happy. For now, Samantha said. But what happens when it's not? When you need assistance with daily activities or medical support? Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. We've been meaning to talk to you about that, David added, his voice taking on the gentle but firm tone he probably used with difficult clients. There's a lovely senior living community in Brookfield. Very well regarded. They have activities. Social programs, activities? The word came out like something distasteful. You want to put me somewhere to make ceramics ashtrays and play bingo until I die? We want you to be safe, David said. And realistic. Mom, I'm barely keeping up with Madison and Tyler's college funds and our mortgage. Samantha's firm is going through restructuring. We can't, if something happens to you, if this college experiment goes badly. There it was, the truth beneath their concern. They weren't worried about her health or her happiness. They were worried about their inheritance, about the possibility they might have to take care of her if she failed. Eleanor felt something cold settle in her chest, a weight she hadn't experienced since those first lonely months after Roger's passing. I see, she closed the folder carefully, her movements deliberate. So you'd rather I sit in my rocking chair? Watching reruns of Murder, she wrote, and counting my pension checks like some miserly old woman, waiting to die so you can inherit what's left? That's not fair, Samantha protested. We love you. We worry about you, living alone in this big house with these unrealistic ideas. Unrealistic? Eleanor tasted the word, found it bitter. Because I'm too old to have ideas at all? David reached across the table, his face earnest. Mom, we're not saying that. We're saying be practical. Enjoy your retirement. Join the garden club, volunteer at the hospital gift shop, find a nice travel group for seniors like Edith Simmons down the street. Spending her days complaining about her arthritis and showing everyone pictures of her grandchildren, Eleanor shook her head. That's not living, David. That's waiting to die. But starting college at 75? Samantha's voice carried exaggerated patience. It's just not normal. Grandma Moses didn't start painting until she was 78, Eleanor's voice grew stronger with each example. Laura Ingalls Wilder published her first Little House book at 65. Frank McCourt didn't write Angela's Ashes until he was 66. Age is just a number unless you let other people make it a prison. David sighed, the sound filled with exhausted frustration. Mom, those are exceptions, outliers. Most people your age, most people my age do what their children expect them to do. Eleanor stood up, her hands flat on the table. They shrink themselves down to fit into tiny boxes labeled appropriate and realistic and safe. I won't do it. But Mom, no. The word came out with the authority of someone who'd spent decades maintaining order in a public space. I've listened to your concerns. I've heard your arguments. Now let me tell you something. She looked from David to Samantha, seeing them clearly perhaps for the first time in years, not as her child and his wife, but as adults who had somehow learned to fear possibility more than failure. Your father and I raised you to be independent, to chase your dreams, to never let anyone tell you what you couldn't achieve. I'm disappointed that you've forgotten those lessons. More than that, I'm hurt that you think so little of the woman who taught them to you. David's face flushed. We don't think little of you. We just think, you think I'm too old. Too fragile, too foolish to make my own decisions. You think I should shuffle off to some assisted living facility and wait quietly for death because that's what's expected of someone my age. Eleanor picked up the manila folder, holding it against her chest like armor. Well, I have news for you both. I'm not done living yet. I'm not done learning, growing, or challenging myself. I'm going to earn that degree with honors. I'm going to sit in those classrooms with students younger than my grandchildren and show them that intellectual curiosity doesn't have an expiration date. She looked at each of them in turn. You can support me or you can keep treating me like a child who doesn't know her own mind. But you won't stop me. The grandfather clock chimed 7, marking the end of another family dinner, another failed attempt at connection. David and Samantha gathered their things, their movements stiff with unresolved tension. We'll talk about this later, Samantha said, her corporate voice firmly back in place, when you've had time to think about it rationally. I've been thinking about it for 4 years, Eleanor replied. Every rational thought has led me to The same conclusion. This is what I want to do with the rest of my life. They left without helping clear the table, without offering to wash dishes, without the usual kisses goodbye. Eleanor stood at her front window, watching their BMW disappear down Maple Street, feeling more alone than she had since Roger's funeral. But as she turned back to her empty dining room, to the cold chicken and congealed gravy, she felt something else stirring beneath the loneliness: determination. The same steely resolve that had gotten her through her first year as head librarian, through Roger's long illness, through the grief of widowhood. They'd laughed at her dreams, dismissed her capabilities, tried to shrink her down to fit their comfortable assumptions about age and appropriate behavior. But they'd also given her something valuable, even if they didn't realize it. They'd given her the fuel she needed to prove them wrong. Eleanor's hands trembled slightly as she gathered the dinner plates, the weight of her son's dismissal settling into her bones like winter cold. The grandfather clock's pendulum swung back and forth, marking time that felt suddenly precious, time she couldn't afford to waste on hurt feelings or family approval. She'd spent 3 days since that disastrous Sunday dinner replaying their words, feeling the sting afresh each time. But this morning, something had shifted. She'd woken before dawn, Roger's voice echoing in her memory, "Eleanor, my love, the only approval you need is your own." He'd said that to her 40 years ago when the library board questioned her decision to add a children's story time in Spanish. It had been true then, it was true now. By 8 o'clock, she was dressed in her best navy pantsuit, the one she'd worn to library board meetings when she needed to project authority, and driving toward Westridge University. Professor Thomas Anderson had offered to meet with her before the semester began, to discuss her concerns about returning to formal education after so many years. The campus coffee shop Anderson had suggested bustled with early summer activity, faculty preparing for the fall semester, students attending summer classes, tour groups of prospective freshmen following enthusiastic guides. Eleanor felt conspicuously out of place among the 20-somethings, her silver hair and sensible shoes marking her as an outsider. She'd arrived 15 minutes early, claiming a corner table where she could watch the door and review her notes one final time. When Thomas Anderson walked in, Eleanor recognized him immediately from his faculty photo: tall, African-American, with close-cropped gray hair and wire-rimmed glasses, wearing a tweed jacket despite the summer heat that spoke to both his English department affiliation and his formal approach to his position. But what the photo hadn't captured was the slight limp in his gait, the way his eyes scanned the room with the shrewd assessment of someone accustomed to reading between lines, whether in text or human interaction. "Mrs. Whittaker," his voice carried a professional warmth that didn't quite mask his curiosity. He slid into the chair across from Eleanor, accepting the offered handshake with a grip that suggested he appreciated firmness in others. "Thank you for meeting with me," Eleanor said, noting how Anderson's eyes flickered over her appearance, taking in the pantsuit, the careful makeup, the neatly organized folder beside her coffee cup. "I know this is unusual." Anderson's smile was polite but guarded. "Your email mentioned concerns about returning to formal education after a significant gap. I have to admit, I don't get many inquiries from," he paused, clearly searching for diplomatic phrasing. "From 75-year-old women," Eleanor supplied, amused despite herself. "No, I imagine you don't. Though perhaps academia would be better for it if I did." A flush crept up Anderson's neck. "I just meant most of my advisees are traditional students straight from high school, or perhaps professionals in their 30s or 40s looking to change careers." "What's your background in literature?" Eleanor opened her folder, sliding her transcript across the table. "Bachelor's degree in English literature from Barnard College, 1970. I was 3 credits shy of a master's degree when I left to get married." Anderson's eyebrows rose as he examined the yellowed document, his professional mask slipping slightly to reveal genuine surprise. "These grades are exceptional. And you've been a librarian for 42 years. The last 20 as head of the Mapleton Public Library." She handed him another document. "My letter of recommendation from Dr. Elizabeth Chen, who was on the library board and is now Dean of Humanities at Hartford College." Anderson set the papers down carefully, his posture shifting from polite skepticism to cautious interest. "What made you decide to return now?" "It's been 53 years since I sat in a college classroom?" "Yes, I'm aware." The question hit deeper than Anderson probably intended. Eleanor thought of David's dismissive laugh, Samantha's patronizing concern, the way they'd both acted as if her educational aspirations were symptoms of senility rather than expressions of continued vitality. "I spent 4 decades helping others access knowledge," Eleanor said, her voice steady. "I watched generation after generation of young people come through my library, and you know what I learned? The biggest tragedy isn't when young people fail to achieve their dreams. It's when they stop having dreams at all. She leaned forward slightly. I refuse to be one of those people who stops dreaming just because society thinks I'm too old to matter. Something shifted in Anderson's expression, surprise giving way to what might have been respect. Tell me about your academic interests. Eleanor pulled out a carefully typed research proposal, her librarian's organizational skills evident in the neat paragraphs and careful citations. I'm particularly interested in exploring how female authors in the Victorian era used illness narratives as metaphors for social constraints. There's a gap in the scholarship regarding less prominent writers like Charlotte Mew and Amy Levy that I believe deserves attention. Anderson studied the proposal, his academic mind clearly engaged. This would require significant research skills, familiarity with historical contexts, literary theory applications, all skills I've honed over decades of literary research. And reader advisory work, Eleanor said. What I lack in recent classroom experience, I make up for in practical application and lifelong learning. Anderson's pen stopped moving across his notepad. Mrs. Whittaker, I have to ask, this program isn't easy. It's designed for students who can devote significant time and energy to rigorous academic work. Have you considered a continuing education program instead? Something less intensive? I've been considering this specific program for 4 years, Eleanor corrected. Every book on your required reading list has been on my nightstand. Every theoretical approach in your methodology course is one I've applied informally in my library's literature discussion groups. What I'm seeking now is the credential to validate what I already know and the opportunity to contribute something meaningful to the field before I die. For the first time since she'd arrived, Anderson truly smiled, not the polite, professional expression he'd worn like armor, but something genuine and warm. My colleagues usually talk about career advancement and employment opportunities. You're talking about intellectual legacy. I'm talking about finishing what I started a half-century ago, Eleanor said. But yes, I suppose I'm also thinking about what I'll leave behind. She thought of her son's face, his casual dismissal of her capabilities. Several things, actually. Anderson leaned back in his chair, studying Eleanor with new eyes. Can I ask you something? Why me? There are other programs, some with more flexible scheduling, less demanding coursework. Eleanor had anticipated this question, had spent sleepless nights considering her answer. Because you wrote your dissertation on aging and agency in literature. Because your recent article on temporal boundaries in academic spaces suggests you understand that intellectual growth isn't confined to traditional timelines. And because, she paused, choosing her words carefully, because I think we both know what it's like to have people underestimate us. Anderson's laugh was rueful. You did your homework. I always do my homework. It's what made me a good librarian, and it's what's going to make me an excellent student. Eleanor gathered her papers, stacking them with the same precision she'd once used to organize library acquisitions. I'm not looking for someone to hold my hand or talk me out of my adorable senior citizen project. I'm looking for an advisor who can help me turn 5 decades of informal learning into a credential that even my dismissive family can't diminish. Anderson was quiet for a long moment, his fingers drumming against his coffee cup. When he finally spoke, his voice was thoughtful. In my last faculty meeting, I spent 20 minutes arguing that our admission criteria were excluding valuable perspectives from our academic community. That our focus on traditional student profiles was undermining our stated commitment to diverse voices in the humanities. He looked up from his coffee. My colleagues nodded politely and then admitted 3 more 22-year-olds with identical backgrounds. Their loss, Eleanor said simply. I've been trying to convince my department that age diversity is as crucial as other forms of representation in creating a robust intellectual community. Anderson shrugged. Sometimes it feels like shouting into the void. I don't want to be a token senior citizen, Eleanor said. I want to be a scholar who happens to have 7 decades of life experience informing her analysis. I want to prove that intellectual rigor and academic contribution aren't restricted to those under 30, or 50, for that matter. Anderson studied Eleanor's face, searching for something, doubt, maybe, or the kind of naive optimism that crumbled under pressure. Whatever he was looking for, he apparently didn't find it. The first assignment in my Victorian literature seminar is a critical analysis of gender roles in Jane Eyre, he said. It's due the 2nd week of class. Most students panic because they haven't developed close reading skills yet. I've read Jane Eyre 17 times, Eleanor replied. The first time at 12, most recently last month. I can trace the evolution of feminist criticism through the changing ways I've interpreted that text over 6 decades. Anderson smiled. I think you're going to surprise a lot of people, Mrs. Whittaker. Eleanor, she corrected. If we're going to be working together for the next 2 years, let's dispense with formalities. Thomas, he responded. And I look forward to reading that Jane Eyre analysis. As they gathered their things and headed for the door, Eleanor felt something she hadn't experienced since Roger's death, the electric thrill of possibility, the sense that her life was expanding rather than contracting. Her son had dismissed her dreams as senile delusions, but Thomas Anderson saw them as valuable contributions to scholarship. The walk across campus to the administration building where she would finalize her registration gave Eleanor time to absorb the reality of her decision. Students half a century younger moved past her, absorbed in their phones, their conversations, their youth. Some glanced at her curiously, perhaps assuming she was someone's visiting grandmother or a lost tourist. Little did they know she would soon be their classmate, perhaps even the one raising her hand to answer questions when theirs remained firmly down. The thought brought a smile to her face and a straightening to her spine that belied her 75 years. As she approached the registrar's office, Eleanor caught a glimpse of her reflection in the glass doors, silver hair neatly styled, posture erect, eyes bright with purpose. She looked exactly like what she was, a woman who refused to let other people's expectations dictate her possibilities. "I'm going to do this, Roger," she whispered to the husband who had always believed in her, even when she didn't believe in herself. "And I'm going to do it so well they'll never laugh at another elderly student again." The door swung open to a new chapter, one written entirely on her own terms. The university bookstore buzzed with pre-semester energy as students loaded up on textbooks and Westridge-branded merchandise. Eleanor stood in the Victorian literature section, comparing editions of a Middlemarch, with the focused concentration of someone selecting a crucial tool. The weight of George Eliot's masterpiece felt right in her hands, substantive, challenging, worthy of her time and attention. "First day nerves?" The question came from a young woman with vibrant blue hair and multiple ear piercings who had appeared beside Eleanor, reaching for the same edition. Eleanor smiled, recognizing a fellow English major from the stack of books in the girl's arms. "More like first day in 50 years nerves." The girl, Zoe, according to the employee badge pinned to her bookstore apron, looked momentarily confused, then understanding dawned. "Wait, you're actually taking classes? That's cool. Most older people I see on campus are just visiting their grandkids or doing alumni stuff." "I'm starting the master's program in literary analysis," Eleanor said, enjoying the surprise that flashed across Zoe's face. "Finishing what I started a lifetime ago." "Whoa, that's hardcore," Zoe said with genuine admiration. "Professor Anderson's Victorian Lit?" Eleanor nodded. "I'm in that class too." Zoe's enthusiasm reminded Eleanor of her granddaughter Madison's excitement over concert tickets. "Everyone says his classes are brutal but worth it." "I'm kind of terrified, honestly." "Perhaps we could form a study group," Eleanor suggested, the librarian in her automatically connecting people with shared interests. "I may be rusty on current academic formats, but I've been reading Victorian literature since before it was considered historical." Zoe laughed. "Deal. I'll bring the energy drinks, you bring the wisdom." As they checked out their purchases, Eleanor felt something unexpected, the first tentative thread of belonging. She'd expected to be an outlier, tolerated but never truly accepted. Instead, she'd found her first ally in the blue-haired bookstore clerk who saw her not as an elderly curiosity but as a fellow student facing the same academic challenges. "See you Monday, Eleanor," Zoe called as they parted ways outside. "First row, right side, that's where the serious students sit." The walk to her car felt lighter somehow, the weight of her textbooks balanced by the lightness of possibility. Perhaps this educational journey wouldn't be the isolating experience she'd prepared herself for. Perhaps, just as in her library career, she would find connection through shared intellectual curiosity regardless of generational differences. The campus parking lot was filling with students returning for the fall semester, their cars loaded with dorm supplies and the excited energy of new beginnings. Eleanor watched them with a mix of amusement and envy, their lives stretched before them like blank pages, while hers was already filled with decades of chapters. But she was proof that new chapters could begin at any age, that the story wasn't finished until the final period was placed. Her phone chimed with a text from David. "Mom, we need to talk about this college situation." "Dinner tonight? Samantha's making your favorite pot roast." Eleanor sighed, knowing that "your favorite pot roast" was code for "we're going to try again to talk you out of this ridiculous idea." She typed back, "Can't tonight. Reading assignments and orientation tomorrow. Love you." She slipped the phone back into her purse without waiting for his response. The family piece would have to wait. Right now, she had Victorian literature to reacquaint herself with and a point to prove. The orientation for new graduate students was held in Westridge's historic Hammond Hall, its Gothic architecture and stained glass windows creating an atmosphere of academic reverence that Eleanor found both intimidating and thrilling. She'd arrived early, selecting a seat near the front where she could hear clearly and take detailed notes. As the room filled with students, Eleanor became increasingly aware of her outlier status. The average age appeared to be mid-20s, with a few 30-somethings scattered throughout. Conversations around her centered on undergraduate experiences that had concluded just months ago, internship opportunities, and career paths that stretched decades into the future. "Is this seat taken?" The voice belonged to a man who appeared to be in his 50s, his salt and pepper hair cut short, his Oxford shirt neatly pressed beneath a casual blazer. "Not at all," Eleanor gestured to the empty chair beside her. "I'm Eleanor Whittaker, literary analysis." "Robert Chen, comparative literature," he replied, settling his messenger bag beneath the seat. "I'm guessing we're the senior members of this incoming class, in more ways than one." Eleanor smiled, recognizing a kindred spirit. "Returning to school after a career?" 27 years teaching high school English, Robert confirmed. "Finally decided to practice what I've been preaching to students about lifelong learning." "You?" 42 years as a librarian, Eleanor said. "Finishing the master's degree I abandoned in 1970 when life took an unexpected turn." Before Robert could respond, the department chair took the podium, welcoming them to what she called one of the most challenging and rewarding years of their academic lives. Eleanor listened intently as degree requirements, expectations, and resources were outlined, her pen moving across her notebook with practiced efficiency. "The dropout rate for our program is approximately 20%, the chair was saying, her tone matter-of-fact. Graduate-level literary analysis demands rigorous critical thinking, exceptional writing skills, and the ability to manage competing deadlines. If you're not fully committed, now is the time to reconsider." Eleanor felt several nearby students shift uncomfortably in their seats. Robert leaned closer and whispered, "I think she's trying to scare off the faint-hearted." "Good," Eleanor whispered back. "I didn't come here for easy." After the formal presentation, faculty members circulated among the new students, introducing themselves and answering questions. Professor Anderson made his way to where Eleanor and Robert stood comparing schedules. "Mrs. Whittaker," Anderson nodded in greeting. "I see you've met our other non-traditional student." "We were just comparing notes on being the eldest scholars in the room," Eleanor replied. "Though Robert has me beat in course load, 4 classes to my 3. I have fewer family obligations," Robert explained. "My children are grown, and my husband is incredibly supportive." "Speaking of family obligations," Anderson said, turning to Eleanor, "have you discussed your concerns about balancing academic demands with your family situation?" Eleanor felt a flicker of irritation at the assumption that her family situation might be an impediment. "My family will adapt to my academic schedule, not the other way around. I've spent decades accommodating everyone else's needs. This time is for me." Anderson's eyebrows rose slightly, but he nodded with what appeared to be approval. "That's the attitude you'll need. Too many students, regardless of age, try to squeeze their education into the leftover spaces of their lives, then wonder why they struggle." As Anderson moved on to greet other students, Robert gave Eleanor an appraising look. "Family not supportive of the back-to-school plan?" "My son thinks I've lost my mind," Eleanor admitted. "He and his wife have already picked out the assisted living facility they'd prefer I occupy instead of a classroom." Robert's laugh was understanding. "My daughter suggested I take up golf instead, apparently a more age-appropriate hobby than comparative literature." "What is it about adult children that makes them so determined to shrink their parents into manageable packages?" Eleanor wondered aloud. "Fear, probably," Robert suggested. "If we can still grow and change at our age, it disrupts their narrative about what aging looks like. Much more comfortable to imagine us in rocking chairs with photo albums than competing with them intellectually." The insight resonated with Eleanor, crystallizing something she'd felt but hadn't articulated. David's resistance wasn't just about practical concerns, it was about maintaining a comfortable worldview where his mother was a predictable, contained presence whose primary identity was grandmother, not scholar. "Well, I plan to disrupt that narrative thoroughly," Eleanor said, her determination renewed. Starting with Professor Anderson's first assignment. The first day of class dawned bright and clear, autumn sunlight streaming through the leaded glass windows of Barton Hall as Eleanor made her way to Victorian literature. She'd spent the weekend immersed in preparation, rereading Jane Eyre with fresh eyes, reviewing contemporary feminist criticism, outlining her approach to the first analytical paper. Her hands trembled slightly as she arranged her materials. At the desk Zoe had saved for her in the front row. Around her, students decades younger scrolled through phones, sipped enormous coffees, and exchanged summer stories with the casual confidence of those who belonged in academic spaces. You look like you're about to face a firing squad, Zoe whispered, sliding into the seat beside Eleanor. Relax. Anderson's tough but fair. Just don't try to bullshit him, that's the cardinal sin. Eleanor smiled at the young woman's attempt at reassurance. I'm not nervous about Professor Anderson. I'm nervous about being taken seriously by everyone else. Zoe glanced around the filling classroom, understanding dawning in her expression. The "what's grandma doing here" factor. I get it. But honestly, most people are too wrapped up in their own insecurities to focus much on yours. Before Eleanor could respond, Professor Anderson strode into the room, his presence immediately commanding attention. Without preamble, he launched into an overview of Victorian literature's historical context, its major themes, and its continued relevance to contemporary society. The Victorian era was a period of profound social change, Anderson said, pacing before the whiteboard where he'd written "Tradition versus Progress" in bold letters. Industrialization, scientific advancement, and evolving social norms created unprecedented tensions between established values and emerging realities. Eleanor found herself nodding in agreement, the parallels to her own situation striking her with unexpected force. She was living that same tension, between traditional expectations of aging and her progressive choice to pursue intellectual growth regardless of societal norms. For our first discussion, Anderson continued, I'd like to explore how Charlotte Bronte uses Jane Eyre to challenge conventional Victorian notions of female purpose and potential. Who can identify specific passages where Jane defies the limitations imposed on women of her time? A tentative silence fell over the classroom, that familiar first-day reluctance to be the first to speak. Eleanor hesitated, not wanting to confirm stereotypes about older people dominating discussions, but the silence stretched uncomfortably. Finally, she raised her hand. Anderson nodded, his expression neutral. There's a passage in chapter 12, Eleanor began, where Jane is on the rooftop at Thornfield, contemplating the horizon. Bronte writes, women are supposed to be very calm. Generally, but women feel just as men feel. They need exercise for their faculties, and a field for their efforts, as much as their brothers do. They suffer from too rigid a restraint, too absolute a stagnation, precisely as men would suffer. She paused, then added, Jane isn't just challenging Victorian gender roles, she's asserting that intellectual and spiritual stagnation is a form of suffering regardless of gender or circumstance, a radical position that still resonates today. Anderson's eyes lit with interest. Excellent observation, Mrs. Whittaker. And how might this passage relate to other Victorian texts we'll be examining this semester? The discussion that followed was among the most intellectually stimulating Eleanor had experienced in decades. Students gradually overcame their initial hesitation, building on each other's insights, challenging interpretations, and connecting the text to both historical context and contemporary issues. Eleanor contributed thoughtfully but measured her involvement, conscious of not overstepping. When class ended, she felt a curious mixture of exhilaration and exhaustion, the mental equivalent of using muscles long dormant. Mrs. Whittaker, a moment please, Anderson called as students gathered their belongings. Eleanor approached his desk, aware of curious glances from classmates. That was an impressive start, Anderson said quietly. But I noticed you holding back after your initial contribution. I didn't want to dominate the discussion, Eleanor admitted. I'm conscious of the stereotype of the older student who can't stop talking. Anderson's expression was thoughtful. I appreciate your sensitivity, but don't dilute your participation out of concern for perceptions. These students benefit from your perspective and experience. Academic discourse thrives on diverse viewpoints, including those shaped by decades of living with these texts. As Eleanor left the classroom, Zoe fell into step beside her. That was awesome. The way you connected Jane's rooftop scene to Mill's essays on liberty. I've read that book 3 times and never saw that parallel. When you've lived with these books for 50 years, the connections become clearer, Eleanor said. What seems revolutionary in one reading evolves with your own life experience. A bunch of us are heading to the Commons for coffee and study group planning, Zoe said, gesturing to a small cluster of students waiting by the stairs. Want to join? Fair warning, we'll probably pick your brain mercilessly about Victorian social customs. The invitation caught Eleanor off guard. She'd prepared herself for polite exclusion, perhaps even subtle ageism, but not for genuine inclusion in student activities. For a moment, she hesitated, wondering if they were simply being kind to the elderly lady in their midst. We really want your input on the first paper, said a young man with glasses and an earnest expression whom Eleanor recognized from class. Professor Anderson's rubric is notorious, and you clearly get what he's looking for. Plus, added another student with a grin, you're the only one who didn't look terrified when he mentioned the midterm project. Eleanor found herself smiling. In that case, I'd be delighted to join you. Though I should warn you, I take my coffee very seriously, and the campus cafe doesn't measure up to my standards. The red door across the street has better coffee, Zoe suggested. And excellent scones. As they walked across campus, Eleanor felt something shift inside her, a realization that this journey might offer more than just academic validation. It might provide a community of minds engaged in the same intellectual pursuits, regardless of the decades that separated their birth certificates. The study group session at the Red Door Cafe stretched into evening, students clustering around a large table covered with open books, laptops, and coffee cups. Eleanor found herself at the center of the discussion, not because of her age but because of her insights. These young scholars treated her with a respect born of intellectual recognition rather than obligatory deference to elders. So when Mill argues for women's intellectual equality in The Subjection of Women, he's essentially making the same case as Jane on the rooftop, Jason, the earnest young man with glasses, was saying. But with less poetry and more political theory. And both were considered radical for their time, Eleanor added, though we might find their positions limited by modern standards. They were arguing for equality of opportunity and intellectual recognition, not necessarily challenging the entire social structure. The conversation flowed from Victorian gender politics to modern educational equality, from literary analysis techniques to personal experiences with academic challenges. Eleanor shared strategies for close reading and effective note-taking that she'd developed during her library career, while the younger students offered tutorials on digital research tools and modern citation software. I should head home, Eleanor said finally, noticing the darkening sky outside. I have reading to complete for tomorrow's theory and criticism class. Same time Thursday? Zoe asked, gathering her books. We could start outlining approaches for the first paper. I'll be here, Eleanor promised, feeling a warm glow of belonging that she hadn't anticipated when she'd nervously entered her first class that morning. The drive home took her past her son's neighborhood, the large colonial houses with their perfectly maintained lawns representing the conventional success that David had pursued all his life. Eleanor wondered what he would make of her day, of the intellectual challenges she'd embraced, the connections she'd formed, the respect she'd earned not for who she had been but for who she was becoming. As if summoned by her thoughts, her phone rang through the car's Bluetooth system. David's name appeared on the dashboard display. Hello, David, she answered, keeping her voice neutral despite the lingering tension from their last conversation. Mom, where have you been? I've been calling all afternoon. We were worried. The concern in his voice was genuine, but beneath it ran a current of something else, irritation, perhaps, at having his expectations disrupted. Eleanor had always been predictably available, her schedule arranged around family needs and obligations. I was in class this morning, then a study group session with classmates, she replied, emphasizing the word classmates slightly. It ran longer than expected. Study group? David's voice carried disbelief. With college students? Graduate students, Eleanor corrected, many of whom have valuable insights and perspectives. We're collaborating on approaches to our first analytical paper. The silence that followed spoke volumes. Eleanor could almost see her son struggling to reconcile his image of his elderly mother with the reality of her engaged in serious academic work alongside people his daughter's age. I thought this was just going to be some kind of audit situation, he said finally. You know, sitting in on classes for personal enrichment or something. You're actually doing the assignments? I'm fully enrolled in the master's program, David. That means readings, papers, examinations, the complete academic experience. What did you think I meant when I showed you my acceptance letter? Another silence. Then, I thought it was some kind of senior citizen program, like those special courses for retirees. Not actual graduate school with actual grades and requirements. The realization struck Eleanor with sudden clarity. David hadn't taken her seriously because he couldn't imagine her as a legitimate student. In his mind, her educational aspirations were a hobby, a diversion, perhaps even a way to stave off loneliness or mental decline. The idea that she might be pursuing rigorous academic work simply because she was intellectually capable and personally motivated hadn't occurred to him. Well, it is actual graduate school, Eleanor said, keeping her voice even. And I have actual assignments to complete tonight, so I should go. Wait, Mom. David's voice took on the conciliatory tone he used when trying to smooth over disagreements. I didn't mean it like that. I'm just surprised. And concerned. This sounds really intense and demanding. It is, Eleanor agreed. That's precisely why I find it fulfilling. Good night, David. Give my love to Samantha and the children. She ended the call before he could respond, not trusting herself to maintain composure through another round of well-meaning but patronizing concern. The rest of the drive passed in contemplative silence as Eleanor processed the day's experiences, the intellectual stimulation of Anderson's class, the unexpected camaraderie of the study group, and the persistent barrier of her son's limited perception. As she pulled into her driveway, Eleanor noticed something on her front porch, a large box from an online bookseller. She hadn't ordered anything recently. The package tag revealed it was from Madison, her 16-year-old granddaughter. Inside, Eleanor found a brand new laptop bag emblazoned with the Westridge University logo, a sleek digital tablet with a note explaining its usefulness for ebooks and research, and a card that read, "To Grandma the Scholar, show them what brilliant looks like at any age. Love, Madison." Tears sprang to Eleanor's eyes as she read the card again. Her granddaughter, David and Samantha's daughter, had not only accepted her educational journey but was actively supporting it. The gesture represented everything Eleanor had hoped for: recognition of her capabilities, respect for her choices, and acknowledgement that age need not define potential. She carried the gifts inside, placing them carefully on her desk beside the stack of Victorian novels and literary criticism texts she'd been reviewing. The contrast between her son's dismissive attitude and her granddaughter's enthusiastic support couldn't have been more stark. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, more classes, more readings, more opportunities to prove herself in an environment designed for people a third her age. But tonight, Eleanor allowed herself to savor this small victory: one family member who saw her not as an aging relic to be managed but as a scholar worthy of respect. She opened her copy of Jane Eyre to the passage she'd cited in class, reading again Charlotte Bronte's passionate assertion that women, all people, required exercise for their faculties regardless of society's expectations. Like Jane Eyre before her, Eleanor Whittaker was challenging the limitations others sought to impose, asserting her right to intellectual growth even when convention suggested she should be content with stagnation. "Thank you, Charlotte," Eleanor whispered to the long-dead author whose words still resonated with revolutionary potential. "We're still fighting your battle, one classroom at a time." The midterm period descended upon Westridge University like a heavy fog, transforming the previously vibrant campus into a landscape of stressed faces and coffee-clutching students. The graduate lounge in the English department, normally a place of lively literary debate, had become a silent sanctuary of intense concentration and occasional sighs of frustration. Eleanor sat at a corner table, surrounded by books, her laptop open to a half-completed analysis of gender performativity in Middlemarch. 8 weeks into the semester, she had settled into an academic rhythm that both challenged and energized her. The initial novelty of her presence had faded. She was now simply another graduate student navigating the demanding terrain of literary analysis, albeit one with 7 decades of life experience informing her perspective. "How's the Dorothea Brooke character analysis coming?" Robert Chen asked, sliding into the chair across from her with a fresh cup of tea. In the weeks since orientation, he and Eleanor had developed a friendship based on shared experiences as non-traditional students. Slowly, Eleanor admitted, rubbing her tired eyes, "I'm trying to incorporate Butler's theories without falling into anachronistic interpretation. And my citations are still giving me trouble." Robert nodded sympathetically. "The digital citation tools help, but there's still a learning curve. My first paper came back with more formatting corrections than content feedback. At least Professor Anderson seems to appreciate my perspective, even when my formatting is questionable," Eleanor said, gesturing to her recently returned paper on Jane Eyre. The margin notes were extensive but encouraging, with phrases like insightful historical connection and excellent textual analysis scattered throughout. "That's because you're brilliant," came Zoe's voice as she dropped her backpack on a nearby chair and collapsed dramatically beside it. "Meanwhile, I'm pretty sure Anderson thinks I'm an intellectual lightweight with a penchant for overgeneralization." Eleanor smiled at the blue-haired young woman who had become an unexpected friend. "He wrote that your close reading showed significant promise but needed more textual evidence." "That's hardly a dismissal." "Always the optimist," Zoe grumbled, but her expression softened. "How are you handling midterms at your," she caught herself, "with your schedule?" Eleanor appreciated Zoe's careful avoidance of age-related assumptions. "The reading load is intense, but manageable. The bigger challenge is adapting to digital research methods. I spent decades with card catalogs and print indexes." "Well, you're doing better than half the 20-somethings in our cohort," Robert observed. "Anderson mentioned to me that your work stands out for its depth of analysis." A flush of pride warmed Eleanor's cheeks. Academic validation from a respected professor meant more than she had anticipated. After decades of helping others access knowledge, being recognized for her own intellectual contributions felt like validation not just of her current efforts but of the lifetime of reading and thinking that had preceded them. Speaking of standing out, Zoe said, lowering her voice, have you heard about the department fellowship for next year? It's usually reserved for doctoral candidates, but rumor has it they're considering exceptional master's students this cycle. Eleanor shook her head. I haven't given much thought to next year. I'm focused on surviving this semester. You should consider applying, Robert urged. The fellowship would cover tuition and provide a stipend for research. Given the quality of your work so far, you'd be a strong candidate. The suggestion caught Eleanor off guard. She had been thinking of her master's degree as completion of unfinished business, a personal goal to achieve before time ran out. The idea of continuing beyond that, of building an actual academic career at her age, hadn't crossed her mind. That's very flattering, she said carefully, but I'm 75. The department would be investing in someone with a necessarily limited professional future. That's exactly the kind of ageist thinking you've been fighting against, Zoe pointed out. Why shouldn't the department invest in exceptional scholarship, regardless of the scholar's age? Your work on Victorian women writers deserves support. Before Eleanor could respond, her phone buzzed with an incoming call. Samantha's name flashed on the screen. Excuse me, she said to her friends, stepping into the hallway to answer. Samantha? Is everything all right? Not really, her daughter-in-law's voice was tight with barely contained frustration. Madison's having trouble with her college applications, specifically the essay portion. She's been asking to talk to you, but you're never available anymore. David's trying to help, but she just gets more upset. Could you possibly spare some time for your family? The passive-aggressive edge in Samantha's tone stung, but Eleanor focused on the substance. Madison needed help, and despite her own academic pressures, Eleanor wouldn't let her granddaughter down. I have a class in 30 minutes, she said, checking her watch. But I'm free after 4. I could come by then. That would be. Samantha seemed surprised by the ready agreement. That would be helpful. Thank you. When Eleanor ended the call and returned to the graduate lounge, she found her friends watching her with concern. Everything okay? Robert asked. Family obligations, Eleanor explained, gathering her materials. My granddaughter needs help with college application essays. I've been so focused on my own academic work that I've been less available than usual. The eternal balancing act, Robert nodded understandingly. My husband has started calling my textbooks the other man in our relationship. As Eleanor packed her bag, Zoe handed her a flyer. Information about the fellowship. Just think about it, okay? You belong here more than half the people with fancier credentials and fewer insights. Eleanor tucked the flyer into her notebook, touched by the vote of confidence but still doubtful about pursuing academic opportunities beyond her current program. One step at a time, she reminded herself. First, survive midterms. Then help Madison with her college essays. The future would take care of itself. Professor Anderson's seminar on Victorian literature was in full swing when Eleanor slipped into the classroom, mouthing an apology for her 30-second tardiness. The discussion focused on the concept of separate spheres, the Victorian ideal. That placed men in the public world of politics and commerce while confining women to the domestic realm of home and family. This ideology of separate spheres wasn't merely descriptive, Anderson was saying as Eleanor settled into her seat. It was prescriptive, actively shaping both policy and social expectations. The angel in the house wasn't just praised. She was enforced through limited educational access, restricted property rights, and social ostracism for those who deviated from the norm. Eleanor listened intently, struck by how the historical constraints on Victorian women paralleled modern limitations on elderly individuals. Both involved artificial boundaries defining acceptable roles and activities, both restricted access to certain spaces and opportunities, and both were enforced through social pressure rather than explicit prohibition. When Anderson asked for examples of Victorian literature that challenged these boundaries, Eleanor raised her hand. Elizabeth Barrett Browning's Aurora Leigh presents a protagonist who explicitly rejects the domestic sphere in favor of artistic and intellectual pursuits, she offered. Aurora declares, the honest earnest man must stand and work, the woman also, otherwise she drops at once below the dignity of man. Barrett Browning is asserting women's right to meaningful work beyond domestic duties. Excellent example, Anderson nodded. And how does Aurora's choice to prioritize her intellectual development over conventional female roles reflect tensions in Victorian society? It represents the emerging conflict between traditional gender expectations and women's growing awareness of their intellectual capabilities, Eleanor responded. Aurora's insistence on her right to creative and intellectual fulfillment challenged the fundamental Victorian assumption that women's fulfillment should come primarily through family roles. As the discussion continued, Eleanor found herself drawing mental parallels to her own situation. Like Aurora Lee, she had chosen intellectual pursuit over the socially prescribed role for someone of her age and circumstance. And like Aurora, she was discovering that challenging societal expectations required constant vigilance against both external criticism and internalized doubt. After class, Anderson asked Eleanor to stay for a moment. "Your contribution today was particularly insightful," he said. "The connection you drew between Aurora's artistic ambitions and Dorothea Brooke's intellectual aspirations showed sophisticated comparative analysis." "Thank you," Eleanor replied, pleased by the recognition. "Victorian literature speaks to me in part because its tensions between tradition and progress, between social expectation and individual fulfillment, remain relevant today." Anderson nodded thoughtfully. "Have you given any thought to presenting at the department's winter colloquium? Your perspective on age-based literary analysis could make a valuable contribution." The suggestion took Eleanor by surprise. "I hadn't considered it. Wouldn't the colloquium primarily feature doctoral candidates?" "Traditionally, yes. But exceptional master's students are sometimes included." Anderson's expression was encouraging. "Your work comparing Victorian restrictions on women's intellectual development with contemporary limitations on elderly agency deserves a wider audience." Eleanor felt a flutter of both excitement and trepidation. A conference presentation would be a significant step beyond coursework, a public declaration of scholarly identity that couldn't be dismissed as merely taking classes. "I'll think about it," she promised, gathering her books. "Right now, I need to help my granddaughter with her college applications." Anderson smiled. "Intergenerational educational support. There's something beautifully appropriate about that." The drive to David and Samantha's suburban home gave Eleanor time to shift mental gears from Victorian literature to contemporary college applications. When she arrived, the tension in the household was palpable. Madison sat at the dining room table, surrounded by crumpled paper and looking utterly defeated. David paced nearby, his expression a mixture of frustration and helplessness. "Grandma." Madison's face lit up when Eleanor entered, the first genuine smile she'd displayed all afternoon. "Thank God you're here. Dad keeps trying to make me write about overcoming challenges or leadership experiences, but it all sounds so fake." David threw up his hands. "Those are standard essay topics, Madison. Colleges want to see that you're resilient and can take initiative." "But the way you want me to write it sounds like everyone else's essay," Madison protested. "It's all, through this experience, I learned the value of perseverance." Garbage. Eleanor set her academic bag aside and took a seat at the table, examining the scattered notes and essay prompts. "Why don't we start by talking about what actually matters to you, Madison? What experiences have genuinely shaped your perspective or values?" David started to interject, but Eleanor held up a hand. "David, would you mind getting us some tea? This might take a while." The request was gently phrased but firm, a diplomatic dismissal that gave her grandson some space to calm down while allowing her to focus on Madison's needs. When he reluctantly left for the kitchen, Eleanor turned her full attention to her granddaughter. "Now, let's forget about what colleges want to hear and focus on what you actually want to say. What matters to you?" Madison's expression shifted from frustration to thoughtfulness. "I care about how stories shape the way we see ourselves and others. I've been reading about how the narratives we consume affect our perceptions of different groups, including older people." Eleanor raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "That's a sophisticated observation. What prompted that interest?" "You did," Madison admitted. "When everyone was telling you that you were too old for college, it made me think about where those assumptions come from. Then I started noticing how older characters in books and movies are usually just supporting characters in younger people's stories, the wise mentor or the burden that needs care, rarely the protagonist of their own journey." Eleanor felt a rush of pride and affection for her insightful granddaughter. "That's a compelling topic for an essay, how cultural narratives shape our expectations about different life stages, and how those expectations can limit human potential." They spent the next 2 hours developing Madison's essay, with Eleanor guiding but never dictating, asking probing questions that helped Madison clarify her thoughts. The final draft explored how her grandmother's decision to pursue higher education had challenged Madison's own internalized ageism and sparked her interest in how narratives shape societal perceptions. David returned periodically, hovering at the edges of their conversation, clearly surprised by the intellectual exchange between his mother and daughter. When Madison finally had a solid draft, she excused herself to polish it on her laptop, leaving Eleanor and David alone at the dining room table. "She listens to you," David observed, his tone a mixture of admiration and something like jealousy. "When I try to help, she just gets defensive." "That's because I'm not trying to shape her into what I think colleges want," Eleanor replied gently. "I'm helping her articulate what she actually thinks and cares about. Madison is remarkably insightful when given space to explore her own ideas." David was quiet for a moment, studying his mother with new eyes. "You're different since starting school. More, I don't know, intellectually confident? The way you guided her through developing that essay, it was like watching a professor at work." The observation caught Eleanor off guard. She hadn't considered how her academic immersion might be changing her beyond the acquisition of knowledge, how it might be reshaping her interactions, her approach to problems, even her sense of authority. "I suppose I am different," she acknowledged. "When you spend your days engaging with complex ideas and defending your interpretations to brilliant professors and fellow students, it changes how you approach all intellectual challenges." David nodded slowly. "I see that now. When you first told us about this college plan, I couldn't imagine what you'd get from it beyond just keeping busy. But it's clearly more than that." "It's about continuing to grow," Eleanor said. "About refusing to accept that intellectual development has an expiration date. About discovering capabilities I didn't know I still had, or perhaps never knew I had at all." Their conversation was interrupted by Samantha's return from work, her professional attire and brisk manner contrasting with the thoughtful atmosphere in the dining room. She greeted Eleanor with cautious politeness, clearly still harboring reservations about her mother-in-law's academic choices. "Did you help Madison with her essay?" she asked, setting down her briefcase. "Grandma was amazing," Madison called from the living room where she was still typing. "She didn't tell me what to write, she helped me figure out what I actually wanted to say. My essay is about how her going back to college changed my perspective on aging and potential." Samantha raised an eyebrow, looking from Madison to Eleanor with new consideration. "That's actually quite compelling. The admissions officers will certainly find it unusual." "That's the point," Madison said triumphantly. "Everyone else will be writing about sports victories or community service projects. I'm writing about how witnessing my grandmother challenge age stereotypes made me question other limitations I've accepted without examination." Eleanor gathered her things, aware that she still had reading to complete for tomorrow's classes. As she prepared to leave, David walked her to the door, lingering as if wanting to say something more. "Mom," he finally began, his voice uncharacteristically hesitant, "I may have been wrong about this college thing. Seeing you today, helping Madison, being so engaged with ideas and education, it's clear this is more than just a hobby for you." The admission, limited though it was, represented a significant shift in David's perspective. Eleanor patted his arm, acknowledging the concession without pushing for more. "I appreciate that, David. We're both learning, just in different classrooms." On the drive back to her home, Eleanor reflected on the afternoon's unexpected developments. She had gone to help Madison with college essays but had inadvertently demonstrated to David the very intellectual vitality he had doubted. Her academic journey was having ripple effects beyond her own experience, challenging her family's perceptions and perhaps even inspiring her granddaughter's educational path. When she arrived home, Eleanor found a package on her doorstep. "Hey. Book she didn't recognize with a note from Professor Anderson. Thought you might find this relevant to your developing thesis on age as an unexplored category in Victorian literary analysis. Your insights in class today prompted me to share this recent scholarship." Inside was a newly published academic work titled, Beyond Gender and Class, Age as Analytical Category in 19th Century Literature, with key sections already bookmarked. The gesture represented something significant, recognition from a respected scholar that her perspective had academic value, that her contributions to the field might extend beyond coursework to actual scholarship. Eleanor settled into her study with the book and her notes from the day's class, feeling a sense of purpose that transcended the immediate pressure of midterms. She was no longer simply completing unfinished business from 50 years ago, she was developing new intellectual territory, bringing her unique perspective to academic conversations that had rarely considered age as a category worthy of analysis. Her phone chimed with a text from Zoe. "Study group tomorrow? Bringing reinforcements. Coffee and donuts. Also, please tell me you're applying for that fellowship." Eleanor smiled, typing back, "Study group confirmed. Fellowship under consideration. Currently reading fascinating book on age as analytical category in Victorian Lit." The response came immediately, "OMG, this is your thesis topic. The universe is speaking. Bring book tomorrow." Eleanor set the phone aside, amused by Zoe's enthusiasm but also thoughtful about the suggestion. Perhaps there was more to her academic journey than simply earning a degree. Perhaps her unique perspective as an elderly student analyzing literature could contribute something valuable to the field, something that younger scholars, brilliant though they might be, simply couldn't access without her lived experience. The grandfather clock in the hallway, Roger's prized possession, chimed 9 times, reminding Eleanor of passing time. But unlike a few months ago, when each chime had seemed to count down remaining years, now it simply marked the rhythm of a life still very much in progress. She opened her laptop and began a new document titled Fellowship Application, Age as Unexplored Analytical Category in Victorian Literature. The future was still unwritten, and contrary to what her family had once assumed, Eleanor Whittaker intended to be the one holding the pen. As her fingers moved across the keyboard, articulating ideas that had been forming since her first Victorian literature class, Eleanor felt the particular satisfaction that comes from discovering new purpose, not despite age, but in part because of it. Her 75 years weren't a limitation but a resource, providing perspective that enriched rather than restricted her academic contributions. The fellowship application would represent more than a request for financial support. It would be a declaration that her intellectual journey was just beginning, that her contributions to literary scholarship deserved recognition and development, regardless of the number of candles on her birthday cake. Aging is not decline. She typed into the application statement of purpose, but accumulation of experience, perspective, and insight. My research will explore how Victorian literature both reinforced and occasionally challenged age-based limitations, with particular attention to how these historical patterns inform contemporary assumptions about intellectual capacity across the lifespan. The words flowed with surprising ease, carrying the conviction of someone who was not merely theorizing but living the very transformation she sought to analyze. As midnight approached, Eleanor continued writing, energized rather than exhausted by the intellectual challenge. Tomorrow would bring more classes, more discussions, more opportunities to prove that education was not a privilege reserved for the young but a right available to all who sought it with genuine passion and commitment. And if her example challenged assumptions about aging in the process, that was an educational outcome worth pursuing in its own right. The winter colloquium of Westridge University's English department transformed Hammond Hall's austere lecture room into a buzzing intellectual hub. Scholars from neighboring universities mingled with Westridge faculty and graduate students, the air alive with literary discourse and academic debate. Eleanor stood near the refreshment table, reviewing her presentation notes one final time while trying to calm the flutter of nerves in her stomach. Imposter syndrome hitting? Robert appeared beside her, offering a cup of tea. Even after 30 years in the classroom, I still get nervous before academic presentations. Eleanor accepted the tea gratefully. It's not just nerves. It's the weight of representation. I'm not just presenting my research, I'm challenging fundamental assumptions about who belongs in these academic spaces. Which is precisely why your presentation matters, Robert replied. Your analysis of age-based marginalization in Victorian literature isn't just scholarly, it's revolutionary in its application to contemporary academic structures. Before Eleanor could respond, Professor Anderson approached, accompanied by a distinguished-looking woman in her 60s whose name tag identified her as Dr. Catherine Reynolds, chair of English at neighboring Hartwick College. Mrs. Whittaker? I'd like you to meet Dr. Reynolds, Anderson said. She's doing fascinating work on marginalized voices in canonical literature and was particularly interested in your presentation topic. Professor Anderson mentioned your research on age as an analytical category in Victorian literature, Dr. Reynolds said, extending her hand. It's a perspective that's been woefully neglected in literary studies. That neglect is partly what motivated my research, Eleanor replied, slipping naturally into the scholarly exchange despite her nerves. The intersection of age with gender and class in Victorian texts reveals patterns of marginalization that extend beyond the historical context into contemporary academic discourse. Dr. Reynolds nodded approvingly. I'd be interested in your thoughts on how this applies to the academic treatment of elderly characters in literature. They're often reduced to symbolic functions rather than granted the complexity afforded to younger characters. Their conversation continued, drawing in other scholars until Eleanor found herself at the center of an impromptu discussion group, defending her theoretical framework and fielding questions about her methodology. The initial nervousness faded as she engaged with these fellow scholars not as an elderly outsider but as a legitimate contributor to the academic conversation. When Anderson finally signaled that it was time for presentations to begin, Eleanor took her place at the podium with newfound confidence. Looking out at the audience, fellow students, professors, visiting scholars, she no longer saw potential critics but colleagues eager to engage with her ideas. Good afternoon, she began, her voice steady. My presentation today examines how Victorian literature both reflected and occasionally challenged age-based limitations, with particular attention to characters who defy the expected narrative arcs associated with their life stage. As she progressed through her analysis, illustrating how characters like Dorothea Brooke in Middlemarch and Miss Havisham in A Great Expectations represented different Victorian responses to age-related expectations, Eleanor felt a sense of intellectual authority she hadn't experienced since her days managing the library board. This wasn't the hesitant participation of her first classes but the confident presentation of a scholar who had earned her place at the academic table. What's particularly striking, she continued, approaching her conclusion, is how contemporary literary criticism often replicates these Victorian limitations by failing to recognize age as a category worthy of analysis alongside gender, class, and race. We readily acknowledge how 19th-century constraints on women's intellectual expression reflected power structures of the period, yet we rarely examine how similar mechanisms operate in our treatment of elderly individuals in both literature and academia itself. The applause following her presentation was enthusiastic, but more gratifying were the thoughtful questions that followed, not polite inquiries to the elderly novelty but substantive engagement with her ideas. Dr. Reynolds asked about extending the analysis to modernist texts, a fellow student explored connections to disability studies, and Professor Anderson posed a challenging question about methodological approaches that might further develop her framework. When the formal session ended, Eleanor found herself surrounded by colleagues eager to continue the discussion, share relevant resources, or simply express appreciation for her perspective. Zoe pushed through the crowd, her blue hair a beacon in the sea of more conventional academic styles. "You absolutely crushed it," she exclaimed, her casual language contrasting with the formal academic discourse that had preceded it. "The way you connected Miss Havisham's stalled developmental narrative to contemporary assumptions about intellectual stagnation and aging, pure brilliance." Eleanor smiled, touched by her young friend's enthusiasm. "I was terrified at first. But once I started speaking about the research, you were in your element," Robert completed the thought, joining them. "That wasn't a student presentation. That was a scholar advancing the field." As the crowd dispersed for the reception that followed, Dr. Reynolds approached Eleanor again, this time with a more specific purpose. "Mrs. Whittaker, I edit the Journal of Victorian Studies at Hartwick," she said. "I'd be very interested in seeing your presentation developed into an article for our special issue on intersectional approaches to Victorian literature. Would you consider submitting?" The invitation, to contribute to a peer-reviewed academic journal, represented a leap from student to scholar that Eleanor hadn't anticipated making so quickly. "I'd be honored," she replied, working to keep her voice steady despite the excitement bubbling within. "Though I should mention I'm still completing my master's degree." "Quality scholarship is quality scholarship," Dr. Reynolds said dismissively. "The deadlines for submissions is April 15th. I look forward to reading your work." As Dr. Reynolds moved away to greet other colleagues, Professor Anderson appeared at Eleanor's side. "I'm not surprised Catherine approached you," he said. "Your presentation was exceptional, graduate student or not." "Thank you for encouraging me to participate," Eleanor replied. "I wouldn't have considered it without your suggestion." Anderson shook his head. "I merely provided the opportunity. You provided the scholarship. And speaking of opportunities," he lowered his voice slightly, "the fellowship committee was very impressed with your application. The final decisions won't be announced until next month, but I'd be surprised if you weren't among the recipients." The reception continued around them, but Eleanor felt suspended in a moment of profound realization. She had crossed a threshold. What had begun as completion of unfinished business had transformed into the beginning of a genuine academic career. At 75, when most of her peers were contracting their ambitions, she was expanding hers, discovering capacities and opportunities she hadn't imagined possible just months ago. As she mingled with colleagues throughout the reception, Eleanor found herself drawn into discussions about Victorian literature, contemporary theory, and potential collaborations. No one treated her as an elderly curiosity, she was simply a fellow scholar with valuable insights and a unique perspective. The winter afternoon had faded into evening by the time Eleanor gathered her materials to leave. Zoe and several other students had invited her to join them for dinner and continued discussion at a nearby restaurant, an inclusion in student social life that still surprised her despite months of growing camaraderie. "I need to decline this time," Eleanor said, checking her watch. "My son and his family are expecting me for dinner. David's been making an effort to be more supportive, and I don't want to undermine that progress." Zoe nodded understandingly. "Academic family balance is tough for all of us. Just make sure they know they're getting the company of a soon-to-be published scholar." The drive to David and Samantha's home gave Eleanor time to mentally transition from the academic intensity of the colloquium to the more complex emotional terrain of family relationships. Despite David's gradual acceptance of her educational journey, Samantha remained skeptical, viewing Eleanor's academic commitments as an inconvenience to family life rather than a legitimate priority. When she arrived, Eleanor was surprised to find not just David, Samantha, and Madison waiting, but also several family friends she hadn't expected to see. Colorful decorations adorned the dining room, and a cake sat prominently on the sideboard. Surprise! Madison rushed forward to embrace her grandmother. "We're celebrating your colloquium presentation." Eleanor blinked in confusion, looking to David for explanation. Madison insisted, he said, a hint of sheepishness in his expression. "She said your first academic presentation deserved recognition, and we agreed. It's a big accomplishment, Mom." Samantha approached, her usual reserve tempered with what appeared to be genuine respect. "Madison showed us the program with your presentation title. It sounds impressive, though I admit I don't understand half the terminology." "It's about how Victorian literature treated older characters," Madison explained proudly. "And how those patterns still influence how we think about older people today. Grandma's challenging fundamental assumptions about age and intellectual capacity." The pride in Madison's voice, the unexpected celebration, the presence of family friends who had come to honor her achievement, it all washed over Eleanor in a wave of emotion. This wasn't grudging tolerance of her academic pursuits but active celebration. Acknowledgement that what she was doing mattered beyond her personal satisfaction. "I don't know what to say," Eleanor managed, genuinely moved. "This is so unexpected." "Tell us about your presentation," urged Dorothy Williams, a longtime family friend who had recently retired from teaching high school English. "Madison says you were analyzing Miss Havisham as a representation of Victorian attitudes toward aging women." As dinner progressed, Eleanor found herself sharing her research with the small but attentive audience, translating academic concepts into accessible language without diluting their substance. What surprised her most was the genuine interest from people who had previously viewed her return to education as an eccentric hobby rather than serious scholarship. "So you're saying that Victorian literature basically created templates for how we're supposed to act at different ages?" asked Bill Thompson, Dorothy's husband. "And those templates still influence how people expect us to behave today?" "Precisely," Eleanor nodded. "Literature both reflects and shapes cultural expectations. When Victorian novels consistently portrayed older characters as either wise mentors or cautionary tales of bitterness, they reinforced limited roles for aging individuals. Those narrative patterns persist in contemporary culture, making it difficult for us to imagine elderly people as protagonists in their own ongoing stories. Like how everyone expected you to settle for book clubs and gardening instead of graduate school," Madison interjected. "They couldn't see you as the main character in a story about intellectual growth because that narrative is reserved for young people." Eleanor smiled at her insightful granddaughter. "Exactly. We internalize these narrative expectations without realizing it. Breaking free requires conscious resistance and examples of alternative possibilities." "Well, you're certainly providing an example," Dorothy said warmly. "I've been feeling increasingly invisible since retirement, like society expects me to quietly fade into the background. Watching you thrive in graduate school makes me wonder what else might be possible." As the evening continued, Eleanor observed a subtle shift in the gathering, from a celebration of her specific achievement to a broader conversation about reimagining later life stages. Dorothy shared her interest in digital art that she'd never had time to explore during her teaching career. Bill mentioned a woodworking course he'd been considering. Even Samantha's father, Stan, who had initially been among the most skeptical about Eleanor's college experiment, asked thoughtful questions about adult education opportunities. "You've started something, Mom," David said quietly as they moved to the living room for coffee and cake. "People see you succeeding in this completely unexpected way, and it makes them reconsider their own limitations." "I never intended to be an example," Eleanor admitted. "I just wanted to finish what I started 50 years ago. But if my journey helps others imagine new possibilities for themselves, that's a wonderful side effect." After the celebration wound down and guests departed, Madison pulled Eleanor aside, her expression uncharacteristically serious for a 16-year-old. "I got my first college acceptance letter today," she said, her voice a mix of excitement and anxiety. "Westridge University. Early decision." "Madison, that's wonderful." Eleanor embraced her granddaughter. "Why didn't you say something earlier? We could have celebrated that too." "Because tonight was about you," Madison said firmly. "But also because, well, I have a huge favor to ask." She took a deep breath. I want to live with you when I start college in the fall. The request caught Eleanor completely by surprise. Live with me? But Westridge has excellent dormitories, and the freshman experience is overrated, Madison finished. I've thought about this a lot. Living with you would save a ton of money. On room and board, give me a quiet place to study, and... She hesitated, then continued with teenage directness, and I want to be around someone who takes education as seriously as you do. The students I've met when visiting campus seem more focused on parties than on learning. Eleanor considered the proposal carefully. Having Madison live with her would mean adjustments to her carefully constructed academic routine, sacrifices of privacy, and potentially complex dynamics with David and Samantha. But it would also mean sharing her educational journey with her granddaughter in a uniquely meaningful way. Have you discussed this with your parents? She asked. Madison nodded. Dad was skeptical at first, but he's warming up to the idea. He says you've proven you're more than capable of managing graduate school, so adding one teenager to the mix shouldn't be too challenging. Eleanor laughed. A ringing endorsement indeed. She grew more serious. Let me think about it, Madison. It's a big decision for both of us. On the drive home, Eleanor's mind buzzed with the evening's developments, the unexpected celebration of her academic achievement, the evolving family dynamics, and Madison's surprising request. As she pulled into her driveway, she noticed a familiar car parked at the curb. Thomas Anderson sat on her porch steps, a folder in his hands. Professor Anderson? Eleanor approached, concerned. Is everything all right? He stood, his expression difficult to read in the porch light. I apologize for the unorthodox visit, Eleanor. I received some news that couldn't wait until Monday. And you weren't answering your phone. Eleanor realized she'd silenced her phone during the family celebration and never turned the ringer back on. What is it? Has something happened with the journal submission? No, nothing like that. Anderson extended the folder. The fellowship committee made their decisions today. The official announcements won't go out until next week, but as committee chair, I wanted to tell you personally. Eleanor accepted the folder with trembling hands, opening it to find a formal letter confirming her selection as a department fellow for the coming academic year. The position included full tuition remission, a research stipend, and the opportunity to teach one undergraduate seminar. Teaching, she looked up, stunned. But I'm still completing my master's degree. The committee felt your professional experience and academic performance qualified you for a limited teaching role, Anderson explained. Your presentation today only confirmed that assessment. We're offering you a position as teaching fellow, with the opportunity to design a freshman seminar on a topic of your choice. The magnitude of this development, not just financial support for continued study but recognition of her capacity to contribute to undergraduate education, left Eleanor momentarily speechless. I know it's a lot to process, Anderson continued. The fellowship usually goes to doctoral students, but your application was exceptional. Your perspective on age as a category of literary analysis offers something unique to our department. The committee was unanimous in their decision. I don't know what to say, Eleanor managed finally. This is so much more than I ever expected. When I applied to finish my degree, Anderson smiled. That's the beauty of education at its best. It takes us places we never intended to go. He checked his watch. I should let you rest. Monday's Victorian literature seminar focuses on hard times, and I expect your usual insightful contributions. After Anderson left, Eleanor sat on her porch swing despite the winter chill, trying to absorb the implications of all that had occurred, not just today but throughout this academic journey that had begun with a dismissed dream at a family dinner. Months ago, she had applied to Westridge to complete unfinished business, to prove to herself and her dismissive family that intellectual growth didn't have an expiration date. Now, halfway through her first year, she had presented at an academic colloquium, been invited to submit to a scholarly journal, received a prestigious fellowship, and been offered a teaching position. More importantly, her journey had ripple effects beyond her own achievement. Madison was finding inspiration in her grandmother's example, David was reconsidering his assumptions about aging, and even Samantha was showing grudging respect for Eleanor's scholarly pursuits. Friends like Dorothy were questioning their own self-imposed limitations, seeing in Eleanor's experience permission to pursue new beginnings regardless of age. The fellowship letter represented more than financial support or academic recognition. It was validation that Eleanor Whittaker belonged in the intellectual community not despite her age but in part because of it, because her perspective enriched the academic conversation in ways that younger scholars, for all their brilliance, simply couldn't replicate. As the winter stars emerged in the clear night sky, Eleanor allowed herself to imagine possibilities that would have seemed absurd just months ago, completing her master's degree with honors, pursuing doctoral studies, perhaps even building a late-blooming but meaningful academic career. The path was opening before her, not narrowing as conventional wisdom about aging would suggest. Her phone chimed with a text from Madison. Forgot to say, totally coming to your first lecture when you start teaching. #proud granddaughter Eleanor. Smiled, typing back, teaching fellowship still sinking in. Would need to design entire course. Madison's response was immediate. Yeah. You've been preparing for this your entire life. All those books, all those ideas, now you get to share them. Students will love you. The enthusiasm in her granddaughter's message crystallized something Eleanor had been gradually realizing throughout this journey. Her decades of reading, thinking, and informal intellectual engagement weren't wasted years or mere preparation for this academic validation. They were valuable in themselves, part of a continuous learning process that had finally found formal expression. The grandfather clock inside chimed 10 times, reminding Eleanor of passing time. But unlike before, when each chime had seemed to count down remaining years, now it simply marked the rhythm of a life expanding in unexpected directions. She gathered her things and went inside, placing the fellowship letter on her desk beside the Victorian literature syllabus and her notes for the journal submission. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, hard times to analyze, research to advance, decisions about Madison's housing proposal to consider. But tonight, Eleanor allowed herself to savor this moment of vindication. They had laughed when she applied to college at 75, dismissed her intellectual aspirations as delusional, suggested she content herself with age-appropriate hobbies and quiet decline. Now, less than a year later, she was preparing to teach university students, her research was being solicited for scholarly publication, and her perspective was being recognized as a valuable contribution to academic discourse. More than that, she was demonstrating in the most powerful way possible that intellectual growth, meaningful contribution, and new beginnings weren't privileges reserved for the young but opportunities available to anyone with the courage to pursue them. As she prepared for bed, Eleanor caught sight of her reflection in the bathroom mirror. The face that looked back at her was lined with 75 years of living, but the eyes sparkled with the unmistakable light of a mind fully engaged, a spirit finding new purpose, and a woman absolutely certain of her value. Not bad, Eleanor, she whispered to her reflection. Not bad at all for someone who was supposed to be knitting and watching game shows by now. The semester's end brought the traditional flurry of final papers, examinations, and academic ceremonies. Eleanor submitted her last assignments with the satisfaction of a student who had not merely participated but excelled, her work consistently earning recognition from professors and respect from fellow students. The English department's year-end reception transformed the usually austere faculty lounge into a celebration space, with graduating students, continuing scholars, and professors mingling in an atmosphere of accomplished exhaustion and anticipation for what came next. Eleanor stood near the window, engaged in conversation with Dr. Reynolds from Hartwick College, whose journal had accepted her article on age as an analytical category in Victorian literature for publication in the fall issue. Your revisions addressed the theoretical framework questions beautifully, Dr. Reynolds was saying. The connections you've drawn between Victorian age-based marginalization and contemporary academic structures are particularly compelling. Thank you, Eleanor replied, still adjusting to being treated as a peer by established scholars. The editorial feedback was invaluable in helping me refine the argument. That's the peer review process at its best, Dr. Reynolds nodded. Speaking of which, I'm assembling a panel on marginalized perspectives in Victorian studies for the regional conference in October. I'd like you to consider presenting an expanded version of your research. Before Eleanor could respond, Professor Anderson approached with a distinguished older gentleman Eleanor didn't recognize. Eleanor, I'd like you to meet Dr. Howard Mitchell, our department chair, Anderson said. Howard, this is Eleanor Whittaker, the non-traditional student I mentioned, whose work on age in Victorian literature is breaking new ground. Dr. Mitchell extended his hand, his expression warm. Thomas has spoken highly of your contributions to the department. I understand you'll be joining us as a teaching fellow next year? Yes, Eleanor confirmed. I'm designing a freshman seminar on age and agency in literature that explores how narratives shape our expectations of different life stages. An innovative approach, Dr. Mitchell nodded approvingly. We need more courses that challenge students to examine cultural assumptions about aging. The demographic shifts in our society make such analysis increasingly relevant. Their conversation continued, touching on Eleanor's teaching philosophy, her research interests, and potential future contributions to the department. What struck Eleanor most was the natural inclusion. No one questioned her presence in this academic space or treated her achievements as surprising given her age. She was simply a scholar among scholars, her particular perspective valued rather than marginalized. As the reception continued, Eleanor found herself drawn into various conversations, with faculty members interested in her research, with graduating students seeking advice on their own academic journeys, with administrators discussing the value of non-traditional student perspectives in higher education. Zoe appeared at her side, resplendent in a vintage dress that complemented her now purple hair. "The department superstar," she teased, linking her arm through Eleanor's. "Everyone wants a piece of the brilliant scholar who's redefining age and academia." Eleanor laughed. "Hardly a superstar. Just a dedicated student who refused to accept arbitrary limitations. Which is exactly why you're an inspiration." Robert joined them, champagne glass in hand. "Do you realize how many people in this room have rethought their assumptions about age and potential because of you? Not just students, faculty too." Eleanor looked around the room, considering. Her journey had begun as a personal quest to complete unfinished business, to prove to herself and her dismissive family that intellectual growth didn't end at some arbitrary age. She hadn't set out to challenge institutional assumptions or inspire others to reconsider their own limitations. Yet here she was, preparing to teach undergraduate students, publishing in academic journals, being invited to present at conferences, all at an age when society expected her to be fading into background contentment with crossword puzzles and television reruns. "I suppose we never know the full impact of our choices," she reflected. "When I applied to the master's program, I simply wanted to finish what I'd started 50 years ago. I never imagined becoming part of the academic community. In this way, the best journeys take us places we never intended to go," Robert said, echoing Anderson's words from months earlier. "Speaking of which, have you decided about Madison's housing proposal?" Eleanor nodded. "She's moving in with me in August. We're converting the home office into her bedroom next month." Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell, so you don't miss any upload from us.